Hi, I'm Bobby Chow, and I grew up in New York, and as well as New Jersey, the Garden State. I actually grew up with my grandparents initially. My mom had me at a really young age, so she couldn't really raise me, so she gave me up to my grandparents, and I also didn't know my dad, so just never knew him. And then I also grew up with my aunt and uncle, just because they moved to New Jersey for a better education, so I basically went with them. And it was basically a Christian household, so I got exposed to the church, went to the church, met friends, and basically grew up in the church, just like a lot of other people. But I remember going off to college, and when I went off to college, there was something that was lingering, and I think it was this anger and this resentment of always questioning my situation. Maybe it was looking too much into myself, but it was questioning why God? Why did I not know my dad? Why did I not know my mom? Why did I live in the situation I did? And I remember just getting caught up in some of that, and really with some of this anger turning away from God and the church, not really wanting to be part of it, got mixed with some of the wrong crowd. But I also remember feeling really isolated and alone. And I remember one time even taking 17 shots of tequila and getting pretty sick. But it was this almost self-medication trying to drown within my sorrow, within some of the pain that I had felt. I remember one day, this was later on, that I had gotten pretty sick and I went to see the doctor, and the doctor told me that I had some liver disease, and he was really quite concerned for me. He even gave me his personal cell phone number and was like, call me anytime, call me if anything happens. And that was one of the scariest times in my life. I was living in Connecticut at this time, and it was away from friends, away from family, so I didn't really know anyone. And then when you're presented with an illness as well, and an illness where it felt like I just wasn't sure what was going to be next, especially when a doctor gives you his cell phone number. And I was pretty scared. And I remember one day waking up, this is shortly afterwards, I was in my own room, and it was a bright morning and the sun was shining in. I just knelt down on my carpet and looked out and basically said, God, I need you. And that was a profound moment, because up till that point, I really hadn't had God in my life. I knew of him, I had heard him, I grew up with him when I was in church when I was younger, but I had left. But I still remembered some of these stories. And it was at that point where I felt like I could turn to no one else. I remember just turning to God. And it wasn't this big story where, it was at a church and there was this altar call and everyone's shouting and screaming and, oh, happy day. It was a happy day, but it was in the privacy of my own home, just me and God. And I just remember this joy that I felt. It was almost like a weight had been just lifted, and I felt the warmth of the sun, almost like the wrapping of God's love around me, and just this comfort of everything will be okay. And I remember with that excitement that I wanted to know more about God and just, find out, all this stuff. And, I had left the church and I didn't even have a Bible. And I remember going to the bookstore and finding the religion section, just looking up and like, oh, there it is. And picking up a Bible. And like what most people do, you open the Bible and you either start from the beginning, Genesis, or, if you're a little bit more, you start in the middle. And that's what I did, because I had read some of it before. And I remember starting in Matthew and just going through the Gospels. And as I went through the Gospels, just this growing love of seeing and hearing God's Word, especially when I got to John. And it was like I loved God, and I realized that I loved God. So it wasn't just like I need God, but like I love God. So I remember one day getting a call from Ian, and it was kind of a surprising call. He called me and he told me that he had snapped his Achilles tendon. And that's a shock for anyone, but it would end up being 2 days right before a mission trip that he was prepping for. And he basically asked me if I could lead, in his place, this team going to Suriname. And I want to say that was probably a definitive moment in my life, because through that process, going on that short-term mission trip to Suriname, I learned and realized that I love ministry, but also wasn't fully trained and wanted to be trained. Because one of the stories is that as soon as I got off the plane, the pastor asked me to preach the next morning. And I didn't know what to say. I ended up doing it, but it was rough. So after the trip, essentially, I knew that I wanted to pursue a seminary education and get trained. So I ended up going to Fuller Theological Seminary, studied my MDiv there in worship, theology, and the arts. And then shortly afterwards, I also served as a worship pastor at Fellowship Monrovia, overseeing their worship ministry and creative arts. Shortly after that, actually, I ended up going back working in the corporate field in marketing, advertising, and where I am right now. And for the longest time, I always thought it was either the church or the corporation. But what I've come to realize is that God can use you anywhere. It's just it blows my mind. It's a different thing that I would have ever imagined doing, that I would have ever imagined possible. But I'm learning that God can and will use you any place, anytime, anywhere, as long as you're willing.